Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Clark, and I'm the training manager at GS1 UK. And I'd like to thank you for joining me on today's webinar. We've arranged this session to provide you with an understanding on how to measure your products correctly. Now, there may be some of you out there thinking, they're my products, I know how to measure them, you plonker. But I think a lot of people will be surprised by what we cover today. Now, just to clarify, in the presentation, you'll notice that the examples used are primarily grocery focused. However, the rules that we discussed today do apply across any sector. Now, although everyone's currently muted, I do encourage questions and comments throughout the webinar functionality, and I'd also like your participation later in the presentation. And just to let you know, the session will be recorded. Now, I think a number of you are here today off the back of the Bossing the Basics campaign we recently sent out to GS1 UK members. We thought that a quiz would be a fun way to check how well people know our standards. For the product ID quiz we ran a couple of weeks ago, we knew that there'd be a mixed bag of people with knowledge of the standards, but for this one, I was sure that the majority of people were not even aware that there was a standard way of measuring things. And boy, was I right. So in a couple of weeks, about 260 odd people have attempted the quiz, and only 18% of people have passed so far. We also asked an additional question at the end of the quiz. Does your company have a procedure to measure products? And I was heartened to see that 42% of people use GS1 standards to measure their products. But then that figure is equally worrying considering the amount of people who also failed the quiz. For the 33% of people who acknowledge that they just do their own thing, I'm wondering if that has ever caused you any problems with retailers, specifically if your way of doing things doesn't match their method of doing things. I'll be happy to see any comments via the question functionality if you have experienced this sort of problem. And I love the 25% of people who don't have any procedure in place at all. I'm stumped as to how you determine your product data. Does it depend completely on who gets their hands on the product first as to what size it ends up? So with all this inconsistency in procedures for measuring products, it's no surprise that we have real issues with product data in the UK. There are occasionally mitigating circumstances though. With all the different retailers out there now exists an abundance of ways that suppliers can provide their product data. I'm sure a large number of you on this webinar are familiar with these new line forms. I'll bet there are a few shudders amongst the audience when this slide came up. Commonly, each retailer has their own method of collecting supplier product data, whether it's a spreadsheet, database, or whatever. Lots of the information will be the same, but a fair bit of it may differ between the different retailers. You might then have the retailers calling the attributes they require by different names as well, just to confuse things. This means that the poor supplier might have to manage and collate all these different versions of their product data when they introduce a new product, but also if and when products change as well. It's no surprise really that things do go wrong. There's a lot of anecdotal discussion about how bad data was in the UK a few years back, so GS1 UK commissioned a report to see how bad the problem actually was. Now, for our data crunch report, we gained the cooperation of 8 of our members and undertook an analysis of their master data. There were 4 of the UK's largest supermarkets, so Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's and Morrison's, and 4 major suppliers as well, so Nestle, Unilever, Procter & Gamble and Mars. Using the GTIN, or Global Trade Item Numbers, to identify the products across the retailers, GS1 UK was able to compare the information held on identical grocery products by each of the retailers. And we found that the high degree of inconsistency and low level of accuracy in what should have been identical information was pretty significant. So the data should have been identical or 0% inconsistent. Using the question functionality, can anyone guess how different the data was as a percentage? So you should see a question box on the right. Why don't you put down a question, how bad do you think a percentage in there how bad you think data was. So we got 50%, 30%, 75%, 80%, 88%, 50%, 25%. A few people have actually got it bang on. 99%. Things aren't quite that bad, although they are bad. A fair few of you are actually underestimating how bad the problem was. It was actually 80% average percentage level of data inconsistency. Now, that is a ridiculously high figure. Trading partners can't do business efficiently if they're looking at completely different information for the same products. With delayed deliveries, returned goods, workarounds, duplicated efforts, and sticky plasters over processes all over the place, it's estimated that poor quality data costs the UK grocery industry over £200 million a year. Now, it can be as simple as pallets not fitting where they should, or trucks going out half empty, or products not being displayed properly in store. But it's important to remember that data is no longer just important to the supply chain. Consumers are demanding better product information and labelling to provide guidance in areas such as nutrition, health, and the environment. This webinar today is going to focus on one particular aspect of supply chain data. The GS1 Package Measurement Standard establishes rules for the global and unambiguous definition of measurement attributes for product packaging. This enables retailers and suppliers to easily communicate product detail for retail and non-retail products, for the consumer unit to the case level and all packaging levels in between. So let's get cracking. So here we have one of the questions from the quiz we put out, and we asked which dimension should be measured as the height of this tin of sweets. So actually, let's give it another quick go now. So again, using the question functionality, would you measure A or B as the height of this item? So it's about 50% each, fair few A's. I think the A's have edged it. Okay, thank you very much. I'd say it's pretty close, but the A's are definitely edging it. Now, in the quiz itself, a mammoth 72% of people got this wrong. The correct answer is actually B. Now, the people selecting A may be saying, well, that's rubbish. The tin would never sit on a shelf like that. So how is the height B? Well, the thing is, what if different retailers choose to merchandise a product in different ways? If one retailer holds a product horizontally and one vertically, they are both going to have different views on which axis is the height. So GS1 UK rules are intended to provide a consistent, repeatable process to determine measurements for a product, but as a result, they may not represent the as merchandised or shelf orientation of the product. So don't forget that these dimensions can be used for other purposes as well, not just for merchandising. So how do you work out which dimension is which? Before you can do so, you need to work out what is the default front of the item. In GS1 standards, the default front is the surface with the largest area that is used by the manufacturer to sell the product. In other words, it's the surface with the markings such as the product name and text elements such as consumer declarations like the net content, stuff like that. For the examples shown, hopefully it's pretty obvious that you're looking at what would be considered the default front of these items. So going back to our ice lolls, this would be the default front. And then once you've worked out what the front is, you could then look at the wording on the front to see which way up the item should be measured. So look for the key consumer declaration text, and once you've got that horizontal, you can work out which is the height, width, or depth. So for your height, looking at the default front, is from the base to the top. The width is from the left to the right, and the depth is from the front to the back. And once you've done that, and only once you've done that, so work out what the front is and then which would be your height, width and depth, then you can start to consider the actual measurements themselves. So bearing in mind that the default front is ultimately what determines a product's dimensions, can have significantly different results for very similar products. So here we've got two multi-packs of yogurt, and both would sit on the shelf in exactly the same manner, but because of the product graphics, both of their default fronts are on different planes, which essentially means that you'd be measuring different dimensions for each of their height, width, and depth. So always use the default front and then consider height, width, or depth. Don't use shelf orientation. Just one thing to note as well, when determining the default front, you should view standard text elements as the consumer declarations horizontally, because branding or graphics may not always be consistent with a horizontal orientation, basically. So if you look at this example, the Elmley is vertical, but all the other text is horizontal. So when looking at this product, ignore the branding itself and look at the key text elements. And once you've done that, you know which one's the default front, and then the height would be from the base to the top. So ignore which way the branding is. So that may be a new concept for most of you there. You need to work out what the default front of an item is before you consider the height, width, or depth. But just to reiterate my point earlier, these rules have been designed to provide a consistent, repeatable, and unambiguous way of determining a product's dimensions. It may seem at times that these rules aren't necessarily common sense, but they are in place to ensure that it's basically a non-negotiable way of providing measurements, regardless of what the product is or how it should be displayed. So hopefully so far so good. Don't forget, feel free to drop any questions you might have during that functionality during the webinar. So we now know where to start when working out a product's dimensions. However, even though you've now aligned your height, width and depths with your trading partners, there is another area of product data where you can fall down. Certain types of packaging need to be measured in particular ways. For cylindrical items, it's pretty straightforward. What you need to do is work out the default front again. And then once you do that, you know which would be the height, width and depth. And because it's a cylindrical item, two dimensions will always be the same. Though which two dimensions are the same will depend on the default front. So cylindrical items, pretty straightforward. But let's mix it up a little bit. So we've got a bag of sweets here in some flexible packaging. For the width, would people measure to the extreme edges of the pack, which would be dimension A, or only up to the seams, which would be dimension B? So again, let me know what you think. Put A or B in the functionality. So say it's 50% AB, 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 AB. Again, complete mix of answers here. Give it another second or two. I think the A's have actually edged it in this instance, and give yourselves a pat on the back. That is actually the correct answer. So packaging, which is formed, filled and sealed without gussets, will be measured edge to edge, including the sealed seams. Now, if people aren't familiar with gussets, in this context at least, they're triangular seams on bags or pouches used to create corners. So how you'd measure this product would be to lay the item flat after evenly settling the contents, and then the measurement should be taken having pulled out, then released the seams. So this rule would apply to packaging where the contents are basically loose, and that might include things like bagged sweets, nuts, dry pet food, rice, things like that basically. Here we have a popular chocolate bar. With all the pictures of pies and sweets in this webinar, you can imagine what my diet is like. But regardless, would people measure A or B for the width of this chocolate bar? So B, B, A, B, A, B, 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 A. Someone very convinced it's B. They keep pressing the same button over and over again. Again, it's a complete mixed bag of things, of answers. Now, people are probably thinking back to the previous example and saying to themselves, well, the answer is obviously going to be A then. Well, in fact, you'd be wrong. Width should actually be measured in this instance using the distance of B. And the reason for that is, for flexible packaging, where the content defines the size and shape of the package, the trade item should be measured by folding any excess flexible material to the product. So for this particular product, you can very easily feel the shape of the chocolate bar within the packaging, and the packaging can quite easily be folded flat against the shape of the chocolate bar. So if there is a very definite shape of the product in flexible packaging, unlike the bag of sweets, what you do is fold in any excess material before measuring the item. Okay, so by now you should quite easily be able to tell what the default front of this item is, but which would you measure as the height of these sarnies? So I just had a question. What was the difference between the sweets and the Mars bar? So while people are putting in A or B there, for the sweets, there were lots of loose, random sweets in there. There was no basically definite shape to that packet of sweets. The products in there were basically granular, whereas the Mars bar, there is a very definite, definitive shape of that chocolate bar which can be felt through that packaging. So for the sweets, you'd pull it and let it settle and you'd measure edge to edge. But for the Mars bar, you'd squish it so that any excess material is folded flat. But going back to this sandwich, basically, again, a complete mix of information. So again, I think a number of you would be looking at it and saying, well, the default front would basically be that front surface, which is selling to the consumer. So logically, it makes sense to measure B as the height of the item. But for items whereby, it's angular or triangular like this, so the product surface is basically lean, you measure to the apex. So the correct answer in this instance is A. And once you worked out that A is the height, again, the width would be to the left and right, and depth would be from the front to the back. So examples of this type of item include sandwiches, as we got here, and also popular Swiss confectionery items. I'm sure you know what I mean. And we haven't just got standards for consumer items. Oh no, you guys generally have to provide dimensions for your cases as well. So we've got rules for those too. If your case has markings on it, which obviously signify what the bottom is, or in GS1 terms, what is the natural base, then it's pretty straightforward to determine the dimensions. So in this instance, you can quite clearly see the arrows pointing up. So the bottom in this instance is the actual base. And then for height, you'd measure from the natural base to the top of the case. Depth or length, and those terms are basically interchangeable. You can call it depth or length. Basically, that's the longer side of the case, and width is the shortest side of the case. So if there's markings on it, if you can quite clearly tell which way up the case should go, height is from the bottom to the top, then width will be the shorter dimension, and depth will be the longest side of the natural base. If, however, there are no case markings and therefore no natural base, you have to base which dimension is which purely on the length of those dimensions. So height would be the shortest dimension. Width is the next longest dimension. And then depth is the longest dimension. So by using these sorts of guidelines and rules, you know that the dimensions you measure and store and interpret and share will be understood exactly the same by your retailers as well, your customers. So they can use it for making sure lorries go out full and ensuring cases fit on shelves in warehouses correctly, because they're interpreting these measurements exactly the same as you. We've got a question about tolerances. So Chris has asked what sort of tolerance is acceptable. Cartons can vary by 5 to 10 millimeters depending on shipping conditions. You're quite right, Chris. Things do vary in size, and GS1 standards actually cater to that. So there is tolerance built into our standards. So depending on whether it's a consumer item, so something that can be scanned at a till, or a case, as we got here, and then depending on what sort of material is it. So is it something rigid, like a box of Maltesers, or is it something flexible, like a roll of paper towels? The variance will differ. So obviously, the more flexible an item could be, you generally get a little bit more tolerance. But typically, it's around 4%-ish, depending on what the item is. But if you want the definitive of the tolerances, let me just flip to the next slide. Basically, we have the GDSN packaging measurement rules. What I've just shown you today is basically a snapshot of these rules. So we covered a bit on flexible packagings and a bit on cylindrical items and multi-packs. There's all sorts of useful stuff in here. And by adhering to these rules, you know that the measurements you provide to your customers, as I said before, will be understood and interpreted exactly the same as you guys. And if you look at the end of this document, section 6 is all about tolerances. So if you go in there and have a look at either consumer items or cases, and then look at what type of item it is, you'll see that there is tolerance built into our standards. And that's important for things like electronic catalogs, whereby if you're providing information about your products, including dimensions, and people are checking it, they're not going to be so strict right down to the millimeter. There needs to be some give and take. There needs to be some tolerance so that you guys aren't penalized for incorrect information, whereby manufacturing process might allow for products to vary very slightly between each other. So, as I said, this has just barely scratched the surface, this webinar today. It was just more to provide information that there are rules and they are important to try and ensure that everyone's looking at this product data exactly the same. But this guidance does go into far more detail. There's stuff on gusseted bags, stand-up pouches, and all sorts of weird and wonderful things in this package measurement rule standard. For example, ever wondered how you might measure a canoe, or a baseball mitt, a crossbow perhaps, or more personal favourite, gear? Probably not that relevant to you guys, but just to show that our standards are open and can be used by any industry. And if next time you buy gear and it doesn't quite sit right, point the brand owner in the direction of our standards to make sure they start adhering to our package measurement rules. One of the questions is, do you have a kind of easy to read handbook that explains about these rules? I mean, that is a fair point. What we're going to do in the very near future is actually provide a UK grocery specific version of this handbook using real products, and hopefully you'll find it's a lot more user friendly and relevant to use going forward. So I can let you guys on the webinar have a copy of that once live and launched. But in the meantime, you'll get copies of this slide afterwards, and also a video in case you'd want to watch it again or send it to your friends, family, but more likely your colleagues. You'll also find links to some useful documents in there. So you'll get a link to the package measurement rules as it is, canoes, baseball mitts and gear and all. We also have some e-learns available on our website, and we do regular class training here in London, or can do on-site training as well. There's also a link to that quiz, which I mentioned earlier. So I'd expect you all to get top marks now with the knowledge you've secured from this webinar. Now, just to let you know, my favourite topic of them all, we do have a barcode course coming up on the 20th of September, if anyone's able to come down and ensure that you get your barcodes right for your trading partners. But if anyone's got any queries about what we talked about today or would like to arrange a training session, please drop an email to training@gs1uk.org.